This game is the result of what happens when you try to make a Cuphead clone and everything goes horribly wrong. This little game here is called Enchanted Portals, the 2D side-scrolling co-op shooter that's heavily inspired off of Cuphead, as you can tell. Except it doesn't have any of the budget or quality of Cuphead, turning it from a creatively inspired spiritual successor to a low quality bootleg. This game is really more sad than anything else because underneath all of the jank and low quality, you can see a glimpse of what could have been a good game, a great game even. Enchanted Portals could have been that next big indie darling that was fondly remembered by the mass audience, being that next Cuphead spiritual sequel that everyone wanted so badly. But instead, things took a turn for the worse, and it unfortunately could not deliver on the lofty promises that it made to everyone, and it just fell flat on its face. And because of that, it will always be remembered as the Cuphead clone that failed miserably through really no fault of its own. And that's what's really sad about this, because the team behind this game seems to be genuinely passionate about what they're making, but they perhaps bit off a lot more than they could chew. And the end result is that we get another Kickstarter disaster alongside Mighty No. 9 and Yooka-Laylee. And I think we all remember how those games turned out.
Is it on the Shovel Knight side, or is it on the Mighty No. 9 side? It's on the fucking shitty side, I'm sorry guys.
So what happened to this game, you may be wondering? Well, I'm not really too sure myself, because this game showed a lot of promise when the official trailer first debuted in 2019 from a small team of 2 developers. And just from looking at it, you would think that this game had all the right ingredients to become a super successful indie project that everyone loved. The team clearly had a lot of passion for the project, it had a clear inspiration of what it was trying to be, and the trailer footage looked really high quality. The trailer even got over 1 million views on YouTube. To me, it looked like this game was going to be a massive success based on how much attention and positive feedback it was getting. But not everyone had that same opinion, because this game had a Kickstarter that sadly failed to reach its goal, only ever amassing a measly $20,000 out of its $120,000 goal, which might sound like a lot of money, but for game development, it's really not. Now, I can't really say for sure why not that many people donated to the Kickstarter. I can only speculate at this point, but I think one of the reasons as to why people didn't donate was because this game looked too much like it was trying to be Cuphead, and maybe because of that, a lot of people just wrote it off as a bad knockoff. Or it could be that the developers simply didn't market the game enough and people just forgot about it as time went on. And I mean, I wouldn't blame them, because this is the internet we're talking about here. Everyone has the memory of a goldfish and forgets everything in about a week. So when the devs went radio silent and took almost 4 years to release the game, the world had already moved on. Whatever the reason may be, it resulted in the Kickstarter being unsuccessful, and because of that, the developers had to find another way to fund this project. I wouldn't have been surprised if this game was just outright cancelled, but to my surprise it wasn't. And after a few years of development, the game actually officially released on September 5th to not so good reception. Look, I'm gonna be honest, Enchanted Portals is really rough around the edges. Like, this game was so undercooked that it was still kicking by the time they pushed it out the door. I do see some hints of a good game here and there, but since the developers failed to gather enough money with their Kickstarter, they unfortunately had to cut a lot of corners to get this game to release. Because it really feels like this whole game was put together with duct tape, bubblegum, and hope. Now, before I rip into everything that this game does poorly, I want to talk about what this game does semi-decently first, and that's the boss battles. Now, there are some things that make them a bit scuffed, like the lack of phase transitions or how the bosses don't have a particularly large moveset. But those problems could be really chalked up to not having enough funding. However, even though there wasn't that much funding, the boss fights still managed to look and play pretty well, all things considered. I really like the designs of some of these boss fights because they were super creative and had some pretty cool concepts. Like the very first witch boss that rides a moon dropping cats on top of you while hammer wielding tombstones are trying to smash you into a pancake. Or the DJ Space Cow boss that turns into a giant laser shooting cyborg in the second phase. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said I could see hints of a good game here, because they do capture the look of a Cuphead boss fight, and it shows how much work was put into these fights because they were the biggest highlight moments of the game. Well, in this case, they're the only noteworthy moments in this game because the rest of it looks pretty bleak. That's why it's all the more depressing to see the rest of the game just fall apart like a wet paper bag. Now, if you think I'm being hyperbolic here, trust me, I'm really not. This whole game takes a massive dip in quality the moment you boot it up. And you can feel this when you spawn in at the very first level where you start to see some of the problems come in. Once you begin the game, you're given a very minimal tutorial that sort of shows you how to play it. But the tutorial is terrible because they give you it through these little images in the background that depict what you're supposed to do, but it never tells you what the buttons for them are. So you're just supposed to fiddle around with the buttons until you find the right one. And not only that, but the default control scheme is bafflingly bad. I played this game on a controller and these were some of the most questionable controls I've ever had to experience. Like, for some reason L2 is the melee button and the other shoulder buttons don't do anything. Why is L2 randomly the melee button, and why does a game like this even need a melee button? You don't ever use it in combat anyway, and the only real use of it is to break down the procedurally generated walls throughout the level. And not only that, but the game had triangle as the dash button and circle as the shield button. Why? I could go on and on about my gripes on the control scheme, but you get my point. The controls just feel like no thought was put into how the player would experience this, and overall just feels awkward to play. And while the controls suck, the level design is much worse because every single level in this game is pretty much exactly the same. That's right, every level is just a straight line from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen with procedurally generated enemies and obstacles along the way. And the same 3 enemies infinitely spawn off screen the whole way through. This makes it so that you're constantly being bombarded with trash mobs the entire time as an artificial form of difficulty. These levels aren't really difficult, they're just extremely annoying because the game throws so many enemies at you that you eventually get overwhelmed and die. And since the whole thing is procedurally generated, the maps just feel soulless. There aren't any deliberately placed enemies or well-hidden secret objects that you can go out of your way to find. Nope, you just walk in a straight line till you reach the end and that's it. I know the devs didn't have enough budget to create every single level by hand and make them super unique at the same time, but using AI generation to do it for them was such a huge mistake because it makes the maps feel boring and uninteresting. Their problem was that the scope of this game was simply too ambitious for a 2-man studio to ever feasibly achieve. These guys wanted to make a game that could match Cuphead in terms of quality and scale, but in order to do that they needed much more resources than what they had, and the result was that they had to release everything half-baked. I would have preferred it if they had just used their resources to make a much smaller, more refined game that carves out a unique identity for itself instead of being a low-quality Cuphead clone. Not saying that's an excuse for the product we got here, because there are plenty of great games made by 1 or 2 people, like Vampire Survivors, which was made by 1 guy, or Undertale, which was also mostly made by 1 guy. Hell, even Minecraft was originally developed by 1 dude in his basement. The point is, you can still make a quality game despite the lack of resources. It's just that you have to adjust your priorities to focus more on gameplay rather than visuals, and it seems like that's where these devs went wrong. Now those are just my complaints about the level design. Everything else in this game is also really subpar. Like, the gameplay is incredibly clunky and feels like you're driving a car on an icy road. Your character is slow and feels extremely floaty to control, which makes dodging all these hazards on the screen much more tedious because your character doesn't maneuver very well. This game also has an elemental system that's extremely pointless and feels god-awful to use. You see, this game has 3 different elements that you can switch between freely at any moment during gameplay that all behave differently, sort of. The green element shoots 3 projectiles at once, the red shoots 1, and blue also shoots 1 but slower. The fire and ice element are pretty much exactly the same. Anyway, the only purpose of these elements is to kill the shielded enemies that can spawn in 3 different colors, red, blue, or green, and you have to use the respective element to kill them. The problem is that switching between elements feels awful. You see, whenever you swap colors, your character stops moving and stops shooting in order to do this little animation. This makes the gameplay feel really clunky because for a 2D shooter that's supposed to be about moving and shooting, you have to stop your gameplay flow in order to just switch to the correct color. So it gets really annoying when there are enemies with multiple colors on the screen and you have to keep swapping back and forth the whole time. Now add on top of that your character feeling like they're on the moon with time playing in slow motion and button presses feeling like they're delayed, and you're probably not going to have a very good time. Aside from that, there's also just a lot of low quality asset flips that are really noticeable. Like the background music doesn't loop smoothly and you can clearly hear when it ends and loops again. There's also a lot of stock sound effects used throughout the game. A lot of sound effects just seem to be missing for some reason, and the cutscenes aside from the first one are just still images. I know a lot of these issues only exist because the game lacked the budget and manpower, but since this game is charging $20 for what essentially feels like an early access title that's around 4 to 5 hours long, I don't think it's really worth it, especially when the game that Enchanted Portals is inspired off of is the exact same price. Yeah, that's right, at the time of this recording, Cuphead is also $20. So why buy a game that's like Cuphead when the original is the same price and infinitely better? This game probably should have been like $10 because it's kind of a hard sell with everything wrong with it currently. At this point, I'm not really sure who I would recommend this game to. And it's just really sad because you can see that there is a lot of passion behind this game, but it just unfortunately fell short of fulfilling its ambitions because they bit off way more than they could chew with the very limited resources that they had. And because of that, this game released half-baked and half-finished. I will say though, the silver lining in this game is that the boss fights had some cool concepts and were decently fun to play. It's just that when you get to everything else in the game, that's where Enchanted Portals falls apart. But that's just me. What do you think? Make sure to let me know down below, and if you like my content, hit that subscribe button for more like it in the future. See ya.